Hi guys, and welcome back. Let's go ahead and start out by creating an application source for us to work inside of so that we can use Canico to run our build and then push up to Amazon Web Services. So I'm going to be using GitLab in this particular case. I'm going to create a new kind of application from scratch so we can kind of see what that looks like to see all of our required dependencies in order to make sure we can build a container image. So I'm going to use GitLab, which you can actually sign up for free, and we're going to create a new project here. So let's go over to create blank project, and I'm just going to give this application a name like my web app, and then I'm going to leave the visibility level at private for now, and then I'm going to hit create project. And once we've got this project created, I'm going to go ahead and just clone this repository onto my local system. So let me fire up a terminal session here, and we'll just do a cd git, and then I'll just do a git clone into the git directory here, and then I'll fire up Microsoft Visual Studio Code, and you can use whatever editor you prefer, but I'm just going to be using Microsoft VS Code here. And then we're going to just kind of pretend like we're building out an application. I mean, we are in reality, but it's not going to have any particular purpose other than just serving up a basic web app. So for starters, one of the things I'm going to need is a Docker file here. And I'm also going to be using PowerShell to create this web application. And there's a really great PowerShell module out there called Pod. I'm actually planning on creating some training on how to kind of deep dive into Pod and actually build out web applications using this. But it's a pretty mature open source community supported framework. It's kept very well up to date, and the author is really good about responding to any issue reports. So definitely a good framework to build a web application in if you're looking for something like that. So let's go ahead and just go into our Docker file here. And I'm going to base this on the PowerShell base image from Microsoft. I'm going to say from mcr.microsoft.com/PowerShell, and then we'll just use the latest tag. And one of the things that I need to do is make sure I set my shell to run PowerShell. And then we'll do PowerShell-command as our shell. And then we'll do a run command and say install module -name pod-force. And then the other thing that I need to do is make sure I set a workdir. And so I'm going to make my workdir/app, but you can kind of set that whatever you want it to be on the container file system. And then I also need to set my entry point. I'm going to set my entry point to PowerShell, and then -file, and then we'll say server.ps1. And then I need to make sure that I copy in my server.ps1 file into the work directory here. So I'll say add, and we'll say server.ps1, and we'll put that under the /app directory. So this Docker file here is basically just going to start with kind of a base PowerShell container image. It's going to create a directory for me to work inside of for my server application. It's going to copy my server app into the /app directory. And then it's going to set our shell here so that we can use the run instruction to run a one-off PowerShell command, which is going to install the pod module during the container build. And then we are going to set the entry point for the container to actually run our application. And we're going to call PowerShell-file and then server.ps1. Now there is a bug that I came across when I was using Canico that I've actually reported on that repository, where setting the shell to just PowerShell directly does not work. It actually can't find it on the path environment variable. So one of the things that I need to do is actually figure out what the fully qualified file system path to that binary is. Let me do a Docker run, and then we'll do mcr.microsoft.com/PowerShell. And of course, if you don't have Docker Desktop installed, you can just install Docker Desktop to get this. And then, of course, I need to make it interactive. I'll do a -it, and I'll say get command PowerShell, and that should show me the directory where it exists. So as you can see, it's under opt Microsoft PowerShell 7 and then PowerShell. So if I just run that, it's actually going to spin up a nested shell. So I'm actually going to specify that fully qualified path on the PowerShell containers file system to call PowerShell here. But just know that that's a bug in Canico, and it's typically not necessary to actually add in the fully qualified path to PowerShell when you're setting the shell instruction in your Docker file. Now we'll come over to server.ps1 here, and I'll just create a basic pod app. I'll say start pod server dash script block. And then inside of the pod script block, I'll do add pod endpoint address all. So we'll basically listen on all network interfaces on port 80. And then the protocol will be just HTTP. And then I'm just going to add a single route to my application for the root of the app. And so what I'll do is just say add pod route. And then the method will be just an HTTP GET. And then the path will just be a / for root. And then the script block here, we'll go ahead and just return some HTML. So I'll say maybe write pod response. Let's say write pod HTML response dash value. And then I'll just pass in a here string in PowerShell with a HTML document. And I'll just keep this really simple. So we'll just set a body here. And then inside that body, we'll say h1. And then inside of that h1, we'll say, welcome to my PowerShell web application. Cool. So if I was to run that application, let's just do a /server.ps1. And of course, I need to run this as administrator. So let me fire up an administrative shell here. And we'll cd into /git/my-web-app. And then I'll do /server.ps1. And that should kick up a new pod server. And then once that pod server is up and running, I should just be able to do invoke web request and say HTTP localhost port 80. And that should return my HTML to me. Sure enough, you can see that that is responding just like we would expect it to. Let me run that one more time just to fix the formatting here. And as you can see, we are getting back that HTML response from the invoke web request command, and it's simply hitting this pod server that's running in this other process over here. If I was to Control-C that and terminate it, and then try to run it again, you'll see it basically just sits there and times out. So I know that this is working okay from the pod server perspective. Now what I can do is create just a simple build script here just to build that container image, just to ensure that it builds locally on my dev system. And typically I wouldn't be doing this, but this is just kind of a validation step to ensure that it works okay on my local dev system before we actually try to run it inside of Kubernetes with Canico. I'll do a docker build --tag pod server test, and you can call that whatever you want to, of course. You can choose whatever tag name you'd like to. I'm just going to use that for now, and then I'll use $ps script root, which refers to wherever the script is running from. So when I run this build script, it's going to refer to the My Web App folder that our project is in right here. And that'll be our build context for the Docker daemon. So I'm going to make sure all my files are saved, and then I'll just do F5 to run build.ps1. And if you don't have the PowerShell extension installed in VS Code, then you can install that, and that'll enable you to hit F5 with an open PowerShell script and just kick it off on your dev system. And keep in mind that you can run PowerShell and VS Code on any platform. So if you're on macOS or Linux, you can certainly follow along here as well. You'll just need to make sure you install the PowerShell runtime on your system as well. And sure enough, it looks like that container built just fine. So let me just do a quick Docker run. And we'll say --publish, and we'll publish port, some random port like port 34001 to port 80 in the container. And then I'll do pod server test. And I'll also do -it here just to make it interactive. And then once our container is up and running, then I should be able to test it out. Let's just do a IWR, HTTP, localhost port 80, and that should return back our HTML. Actually, it's port 34001 because that's the external port that I mapped from Docker Desktop into the container. And sure enough, you can see we get back our HTML here. So now what I need to do is, since we've validated that our project is working correctly, we're just going to go ahead and bring that into our Git repository. that will stage all these changes and say add web server project files. And then we'll just do a git push to push that up to our GitLab repository. And then over in GitLab here, we should just do a quick refresh here, and we should have all of our files inside of our project here. So now that we've got our application source all set up, we can start to take a look at how to set up Canico to actually read this source from GitLab. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.